Welcome everybody to LG demonstration number 3. Today's subject is going to be a game from Practice Test 80, Section 3, questions 19 through 23. This is, I believe, is from 2016, and while I don't think this has made any lists recently of like the most difficult games out there, it is one that comes up in my instruction fairly frequently as just sort of an odd game, and it is a bit unusual. So let's get right into it. So what makes this one unfun? This kind of game is what Kaplan, I'm not sure what other places call it, but I think they go by the same name. But Kaplan, where I learned of this game's existence, where I started teaching, calls this a process type game. So that's the terminology I'll use. Unlike the more standard types that you're used to, process games aren't actually that susceptible to diagramming. Don't get me wrong, there is a place for writing things down and diagramming things out, but it's not going to be quite as game-breaking, really. Game-breakingly helpful and useful to draw a diagram as it is in other types. So a little bit more about process games themselves. They appeared relatively few times, I would say, and the last times that they really appeared with any sort of regularity was over 20 years ago, like before the year 2000. So we're talking the 90s. But we saw them again in 2016, and a lot of you were pretty unhappy. Don't be mad, though. Don't be mad. That's the point of this video. Process games are, in a very real way, just a purified or distilled form of the same old LG that you've always been doing. You're doing the same fundamental thing. You take data, apply rules to those data, and then you see what results. That's literally what you do in every single game, whether it's one that you're familiar with or not. So let's get right into it. Intro paragraph, as we always start off with. This time it looks like we are dealing with 3 real estate companies, R, S, and T. They are considering trading buildings with one another, and at this point I am not sure if the buildings are named yet. Each building is classified as Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3. Okay, here now we do get the names of the buildings. This is what the initial ownership situation looks like. Company R has Building G, which is Class 1, Building Y, which is Class 3, and Building Z, which is also Class 3. Company S has Building F, which is Class 1, and Building L, which is Class 2. And finally, we have Company T, which has 3 buildings, Building K, Class 2, Building M, also Class 2, and Building O, which is also Class 2. So T is kind of unique amongst the 3 companies. It looks like it only has Class 2 buildings to start with. Alright, incidentally, this is going to be my diagram, so to speak. I can't really, as I was reading the first 3 bullet points here, I really had no idea how I was going to do this, but they've kind of laid it out here for me, so I'm just going to go with this. A note, if I were doing this on scratch paper, I'd probably write the class numbers here as subscripts just to kind of keep things a little bit, neater, I guess. But thanks to the clunkiness of the PowerPoint and Google Slides formatting that I use for these videos, though, doing subscripts I found kind of messed with the line spacing and whatnot, so I am not going to do that here. And also, since the action of this game is going to involve moving buildings from one owner to another, the actual complete diagram of a single round of trading might involve both a before scenario and an after scenario listing of the buildings. Alternately, we may use just a single table and then use arrows or something else to denote where properties are traded, but I personally imagine this would be something of a nightmare for me organizationally, so I'm not going to consider this option. It's just not how I am wired to think of this thing. So again, there's nothing that, groundbreaking here. They give you a listing of buildings, and that happens to be, in my mind, the most useful way to begin thinking about this, so I'm not going to do anything other than just adopt what they have on the page here. So that's the intro paragraph. Let's move into the next section, which is, of course, our rules. So there are only 3 kinds of trades that are allowed in our regime here. Rule number 1 tells us that the first kind of trade that is allowed is one building for another building of the same class. This is pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. I don't think there's very much else to say about it. The second kind of trade that is allowed, Rule 2, you can trade one class building for 2 Class 2 buildings. So I guess a Class 1 building is worth more, so to speak, than a Class 2 building, because you can buy, I guess, one Class 1 building for 2 Class 2 buildings. So 1 is more expensive than 2. It takes 2 2s to buy a single 1. And finally, Rule 3, the third and last kind of trade that is allowed, you can, just like the relationship with 1 and 2, it takes 2 Class 3 buildings to purchase 1 Class 2 building. So that these are the ratios. Again, a pretty simple setup. Same class, you can do a 1-for-1 trade, but if you want to move up a tier, I guess, you have to give up 2 of the lower class building to get 1 of the higher class building. Again, pretty simple here. So any deductions? Really none whatsoever. Which is, of course, if you guys have been following my content to any extent, this should not come as a surprise to you. I mean, there's probably something I could figure out if I applied the rules to the initial ownership scenario, but I'm not sure I'll find anything useful or how long it's going to take. So as usual, I'm just going to dive right into the questions. So starting with question number 19. What would the picture look like after 1 round of trading? So I think this is actually going to be the closest possible equivalent of a rule checker that we're going to get in this game. And of course, it being the first question also kind of lends itself to that assumption on my part. I mean, how else are we going to figure out which one of these is a valid picture, right? The only thing I can think of is to make sure that they follow the rules, and that's what a rule checker is. They give you a list of answers, and you have to pick the one that follows all the rules. But normally for a rule checker, of course, I'd start with rule number 1, check all 5 answers, then move to rule number 2, etc. However, for this one, I am not sure that'll work for me. At this stage of the game, very early on, with no deductions and literally no work, because my diagram is going to be the one that they gave me in the sort of intro paragraph there. So at this stage, I want to be able to compare the before diagram against the after one to see what's going on with the trading aspect of things. So that's how I'm going to approach this one. And because of that, I'm going to look at the answers and then check the rules instead of the other way around. So again, I'll check each answer against all the rules instead of the usual way, which is the reverse. I start with a rule and then check each answer against each rule and then move to the next rule. Not going to do that here. So continuing on with this question, we'll start right up with answer choice A. So we'll have our handy before and after pictures here. And here we go. This one suggests that the after scenario, after 1 trade, we have R with F and G, S has L, Y, and Z, and T has K, M, and O. So the first thing I see is that T hasn't actually traded any of its buildings in this scenario. So when it comes to any changes in R and S, all of that has to happen without the involvement of anything from T. Again, I'm not sure how helpful that's going to be, it's just what I notice here. So starting right from the top, what changed about R? R seems to have lost Y and Z and gained F in exchange. Can that be accomplished within a single trade? And no, it doesn't appear to be possible. The rules tell us that to gain F1 in a single trade, R would have needed to give S 2 Class 2 properties, which R doesn't start with that. R doesn't have that. So it's not possible for R to have gained a Class 1 property based on its starting point of having G a Class 1 and then Y and Z both Class 3 properties. R doesn't have anything to give to S that will allow S to give its Class 1 property F over to R. That's not possible. So I eliminate this one. So far, so good. Now looking at B. So here's the before and after. The before is the same. It's the intro. It's the one that they gave us in the intro setup. And the after suggested by B is R has G, K, and O, S has F and L, and T has M, Y, and Z. So in this one, the first thing that I see is that S this time hasn't traded any of its buildings. F started with F and L, and it ended the trade with F and L. So it didn't trade anything. So when it comes to any changes in R and T, all of that has to happen without the involvement of anything from S. And while that wasn't like a huge game-breaking thing for the last answer choice, it was handy because all we had to do was see, okay, if R and T are the ones that traded, does R have what it takes to get this entity from T? So the same thing is going to apply here. So starting right from the top, what changed about R? R seems to have lost Y and Z and gained K and O in exchange. Now, can that be accomplished within a single trade? And the answer again is no. In order to get 2 Class 2 buildings, R needs to do either trade away 1 Class 1 building to get those 2 Class 2 buildings, or it would have to somehow find a way to trade 4 Class 3 buildings in exchange for 2 Class 2 buildings. Note that 4 Class 3 buildings don't even exist in the game, period. Y and Z are the only two that exist as class 3 amongst all the buildings across all the companies. And it turns out that R is still hanging on to the sole class 1 building that it had, G1. So option 1 clearly isn't it. And as we just discussed, R most certainly didn't have 4 class 3 buildings to trade away. Nobody does. Even if we took all the class 3 buildings in the entire game, there's not enough. So option 2 also isn't it. And given that those are the only two ways that R could possibly have obtained 2 class 2 buildings, that means that it's just not what we're looking for. So we eliminate B. It's not possible. Moving on to answer choice C. So again, we have our handy before and after pictures here. So the before, as always, is the same. It comes from the intro paragraph. The after, suggested by C, is R has G and L, S has F, Y, and Z, and T is walking away with K, M, and O. So very much like A, the first thing that I noticed is that T hasn't made any trades. So again, when it comes to any changes in R and S, all of that has to happen without the involvement of anything from T. So starting from the top, what changed about R? It looks like R lost Y and Z and gained L in exchange. Can that be done in a single trade? And yes, finally, this is the first time we've been able to say yes to that question. It is a trade according to one of the rules. It's one of the allowed trades. R could gain a single class 2 building, L, by trading its 2 class 3 buildings, Y and Z, for it. So yeah, this definitely works. So we select it. So note here that we didn't need any deep, super secret ninja LG mastery of this game. It's literally as simple as you're allowed to get 1 class 2 building if you trade away 2 class 3 buildings. It's literally just one rule. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. As long as you do things in digestible pieces without panicking about the overall game and panicking about not having super control over every single aspect of it, you're going to be okay. It's going to turn out fine. So this now brings us to question 20. Which one of the following must be false no matter how many trades are made? So I'm sure again that there's some deductive magic that might speed this along, but of course, as I've said a couple times already, I didn't bother doing any of that. I rarely do. All I have on hand is my experience of testing answers A through C on question 19. I didn't really discern any overall patterns in doing so, but I did gain a general sense of suspicion whenever a company acquires higher class buildings. If you didn't have any class 2 buildings but you got one, my first immediate question is, what did you have to give up? Did you have the resources, the assets to give up to obtain that higher class building? So with nothing else in my back pocket, I'm just going to dive right into answer choices here on number 20. So 20, again, which one must be false no matter how many trades are made, starting right up with A. Again, as always, we have our handy before and after scenario. And this time I'm not going to bother with filling out the rest of the after picture because the answer choices don't give me the whole thing and I'm not going to really figure it out because it's uncertain. So the before is the same as always. It's from the intro paragraph, and the after, according to answer choice A, is R ends up with F and G. So my suspicions or my alarm bells are going off. R managed to obtain an additional Class 1 building while also hanging on to the Class 1 that it already had. Can it manage a chain of trades to achieve this? I have my doubts again because Class 1 is the highest class of building that we have. It takes the most juice, so to speak, and I'm not sure that R has enough juice to obtain both of them, really, without having a whole lot of resources to do it. So it's going to be quite difficult at the very least. So the first imaginary trade that I can think of linking the before and after picture that we have, R trades its Y and Z, which are Class 3 buildings, to T for any old Tier 2 building, which is a Class 2 building, and so the first one on the list is K. It doesn't have to be K. I'm just saying it's K because K is the first in alphabetical order that T owns. So now it has G, a Class 1 building, and K, a Class 2 building. From there, how is it ever going to manage to turn a single Class 2 building into a single Class 1 building? I just don't think that's possible. It just doesn't have the resource power, so to speak, to do it. At this point, it would have to trade away the one Class 1 building it does have to obtain 2 more Class 2s, maybe. So it can try to obtain a different Class 1 with the total 3 Class 2s it would have as a result. This feels like robbing Peter to pay Paul. It has to keep, ultimately, in order to honor answer choice A. Answer choice A alleges that after all is said and done, R is hanging on to F, a Class 1 building, and G, a Class 1 building. Trading away that G to get F, and then trying to trade back up to get F or F or G again. It just doesn't feel like it works because we have to keep working towards obtaining and holding on to these tier 1 buildings, these class 1 buildings, but there's no resources available for R to do that. It seems dumb. The whole point was to see how hard it was for R to get more class 1s, and trading one class 1 in pursuit of another, it just doesn't seem like it's going to get us any closer to getting R a total of 2 class 1s. So while I'm not 100% sure yet, maybe there's some really convoluted way where, R basically gets almost all the buildings by itself somehow, and then strategically trades them away, and it obtains a tier 1 building at the result of that. Maybe that's possible, but I just don't see it happening. So I'll come back and reconsider if everything else goes wrong in the answer choice list. But for now, I'm actually going to select this one because I just don't see a way for it to happen. It doesn't seem instinctively possible to me. So moving on to answer choice B. So again, we have our before and after scenario here. Before, as always, is the same. It's from the intro paragraph. The after scenario suggested by B is that S has ended up with F and M. This seems immediately more feasible right off the bat. S kept its class 1 building, F, and seems to have traded out a single class 2, L, to obtain another single class 2, M. So I see no reason why T couldn't manage this even in a single trade. S gives L to T, and T gives M to S. So I'm going to eliminate this one. This definitely seems possible, if within just one trade. So hopefully this is a sign of things to come, positive results. So moving on to answer choice C. Now we have, as always, our before scenario, same one from the intro paragraph, and our after scenario is that S ends up with G and L. And this also seems quite feasible. It's very similar to B, except this time S appears to have traded one class 1 building, F, to obtain one class 1 building, G. So just like you can just do a one-to-one trade, S can give its F to R in exchange for R's G, and that's a one-to-one trade within the same class, and it works. So I'm going to eliminate this one as well. So on to 20. Which one of the following must be false no matter how many trades are made, as always? So D, we have our before and we have our after. And this time, the after suggests that T has F and O. So this also seems quite feasible according to the rules. It appears that T has traded 2 of its class 2s, K and M, to obtain one single class 1 building, F. And so because that seems quite feasible and within the rules, I am going to eliminate it. So moving on to E. As always, we have our before from the intro paragraph, and now the after that they suggest is that R has G and M. This also seems quite feasible according to the rules. It appears that R traded 2 class 3s, Y and Z, to obtain one class 2, which is M. This is of course allowed by rule number 3, so we eliminate this answer because it is possible. So just some final remarks. It really wasn't that bad. We didn't have to figure out a whole chain of trades as the question might have suggested. We eliminated B3 on the basis of things that were possible within a single trade. The only hard part for me was actually A. I wasn't sure I had enough of the game figured out to know for sure that A wasn't possible. But the rest of the answers turned out to be quite helpful. They were all very easily eliminable based on, like we just said, single trades. So again, I want to emphasize, you don't need super secret, deep LG knowledge that so many of you think you need. That's a lie. That is just a bald-faced lie. Just start with what you do know and work carefully from there. You'll find that you don't need all that deep, far-reaching mastery of a game to make forward progress, even when it's a very foreign situation like this one. So moving on to question 21 on that note. If R only has class 2 buildings in its inventory after some unspecified number of trades, what must be true? So there is some uncertainty for me on this one to begin with. When it says buildings with an S, does that require R to own more than one? I don't think so. If I ask the question, what buildings does R have, and the answer is it just has L, I think that's okay, but I'm not sure. The other uncertainty that I have is that I don't know which class 2s R actually has. But on balance, this actually feels like a good thing, since it leaves us free to go after whatever Class 2 building we need to in order to get the job done. So moving on to how to actually start this question. Being a must-be true question, that also happens to give us a bit of data. Normally, on any other game, I try to plug in the data that we're given by the question stem, and then see if there are any necessary outcomes based on that plug-in. And I don't really see a reason why we can't do the same thing here. So what it looks like for this question is that I'm going to start with, how would it be possible for R to end up with only class 2s to begin with? How is that possible? Because that's the data that we have, right? R only has class 2s. How does that work? What are the necessary outcomes of that situation? So my first step would be for R to trade out G for 2 class 2s. Because G, of course, is a class 1, and we want to eventually have R end up with only class 2s. And so the idea is just to get rid of its non-class 2s and get class 2s in exchange whenever possible. The only such trade it could make is with T, since S only has 1 class 2 to give up. And as such, S can't facilitate that trade. It can't take away R's class 1 building G and give it 2 class 2s in exchange. It can't accomplish that. So I'm going to imagine that R trades with T, because T can accomplish that. T does have the class 2s to give away to R. So the before and after here. The before, as always, is our intro paragraph version, and the after the trade that I'm imagining, this is what the situation looks like. R has obtained, again, it's arbitrary, R has obtained K and M, I just took the first 2 in T's list, and has given T in exchange its G. So this is the scenario. Now from here, note that we don't even know which of T's class 2 buildings R ended up with. Like I just mentioned, I picked K and M because they were alphabetically the first 2 in T's list. It could have been any 2 among K, M, and O. What I do know is that regardless of which class 2s that it got from T, R must have given G to T. And again, this is because if R wants to get rid of G and get class 2s in exchange, there's only one way to do that. S doesn't have enough class 2s to trade away to R, but T does. So I imagine that R traded G to T, and T gave up 2 class 2 buildings to R in exchange. Frankly, this might be enough to answer the question alone, but I do want to see if there's anything else that results from finishing out the scenario. So I'm going to keep going here. The next step would be for R to trade out its 2 class 3s for a single class 2. That would be a way that R can get all class 2 buildings. Because right now, in the picture that I have, it has 2 class 2s that it got from T, and it's still hanging on to the class 3s that it started off with originally. My goal is not to get rid of those, and an easy fix would be to trade both of those 3s out for a 2. Here, though, the problem is that it's not a for sure thing. There's uncertainty. R could make the trade to S and obtain L in exchange. It could give Y, which is a class 3, and Z, which is a class 3, and get L, which is a class 2, from S. It could do that. Or R could make the trade to T and obtain O at this point. So it's either one. I don't see any compelling reason why it has to be one or the other. So since we don't know who R makes this trade to, we also don't know precisely which class 2 building that it gets as a result. Does it get L because it has to trade with S? No, it could have easily traded with T and gotten the last remaining class 2 building from T. So we really know nothing for sure. All we know is that T ended up with G for sure, which is consistent with A. Even though that's not exactly what A says just generic class 1 building, we do know that T has one. So I am going to select A for now. You might have some residual reservation about the vagueness of T owns A unspecified class 1 building. And so to confirm, if you want to really confirm this, is there any way after trading to a point where R has only class 2s, is there a way for T to end up with 2 or no class 1 buildings? Is there a way for us to get away from what answer choice A says? And the answer is no on both counts. We've seen already in a previous question how impossible it is to start with class 1 and class 2 and end up with another class 1. So it's not possible for T to end up owning 2 class 2 buildings. That's just not possible. The other possibility is also impossible, though. It's also impossible for T to trade away G1 without basically grabbing its 2 class 2s back from R, which defeats the whole purpose of this exercise. So it seems impossible
for T to not have a single tier 1 building at the end of it all. Because we know that to start with, R, the only way R can offload its class 1 building is to give it to T. And then now that T has it, there doesn't seem to be a way for either T to get another class 1 building or for T to get rid of the one class 1 building that it has. So it does seem to be true that T has to have one single class 1 building at the end of it all. So I wouldn't do this personally, but for the sake of instruction, I will eliminate the rest because I understand that little bit of confirmation at the end there. It was when I was doing it for myself in my head, it was kind of fast and instinctive, but it may not be. It may be more efficient for the rest of you to actually eliminate the rest of the answers. It's not actually going to be that hard. So again, we have our before and after situation here. Answer choice B. Does this have to be true? And no, it does not, so we eliminate this one. There's no indication that T has to own M at this point. Remember that we didn't know which among K, M, and O that T traded R, so there's no reason to believe that T must be holding on to M. It didn't have to be like K and O. It could have been K and M, it could have been M and O, it could have been K and O. It could have been any combination of the three letters that T has. There's nothing telling us that T has to have hung on to M by the end of it all. C we also get to eliminate. S could have been the one to trade L for Y and Z in order to allow R to finally get only class 2 buildings. But there's no reason that it must hold on to its class 2 building. As we saw, T could have been the one to take Y and Z and also trade away its final class 2 building to give R 3 class 2 buildings. So yeah, this one also we can eliminate. D we can also eliminate. Instead of S, T could have traded its class building, which is what we just said for C. So for the same reason as C, we can eliminate D. And finally, E we can also eliminate. There's nothing stopping S from trading F to T in exchange for obtaining G. Once we're kind of done with R and we've given R 3 class 2 buildings, that means S has F as a class 1 building and T is still hanging on to G as a class 1 building. Those two could still just trade those with each other. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. So that's why E does not have to be true. So moving on to 22. If T has no class 2 buildings after some number of trades, what's must be true? This is kind of the mirror opposite of question 21. So looking at our trusty starting scenario here, which of course you should be familiar with by now, we've seen it so many times. How can we get T to not have any class 2s? Our goal again before was to have R with only class 2s. Now our goal is to get T to get rid of all of its class 2s. So the first step, kind of like last time, I'm going to trade out 2 of the class 2s that T has for one single class 1. But this is uncertain. T can give away 2 of its class 2s to either R for G or to S in exchange for F. So either R or S can accommodate this trade. So we don't know who exactly ends up with the first of T's class 2 buildings that it trades away. But even if we don't know who T gives those class 2 buildings to, we do know that it has to give them to someone if we want to completely divest T from class 2. So that's kind of handy, but it doesn't really help us progress visually at all. So the second step that I do, okay, so we don't know who it gives it to, we just know that it does give away 2 of its buildings to one of R or S. We have to trade out the remaining class 2 that T possesses. It seems the only way that we can get rid of this third and final class 2 building that T is hanging on to, the only way to get rid of it is to trade it to R in exchange for Y and Z. Because if we trade it to S, if we trade the last remaining tier or class 2 building to S, the only thing that S could really do is give us L in exchange, which is in the class 2, and that wouldn't get us any closer to our goal. And bingo. E does say that it must be true that T ends up with Z, so we're going to select that one. But much like 21, again, while I wouldn't do this personally on my exam, for instructional purposes, we will eliminate the rest here. So A we can eliminate. The very first thing we found out is that we didn't know for sure if T made that initial 2 class 2s for 1 class 1 trade to R or S. That's the very first thing that we found out. Therefore, we don't know if R ended up hanging on to its class 1 or if S was the one to do that, so there's no way to know for sure if A is actually must be true or not. This is the flip. B is very similar. It's the flip side of A. So we get to eliminate B because we don't know that S had to be the one to trade away its class 1 and end up with 2 of T's class 2s. We don't know that that had to be the case. So for the same reason we got rid of A, we're getting rid of B. C we can also eliminate. It's possible that T offloaded all of its class 2s just by trading with R. It could give 2 class 2s to get G and the remaining class 2s to get Y and Z. It could have done that. D we can also eliminate. It's more of the same as A and B. We don't know that R had to be the one to give its sole class 1 building G to T. So barreling right along to the final question here, number 23. Which one must be false no matter how many trades are made? This is basically a repeat of question 20, so I'm really just going to do it the same way. So starting with answer choice A, we have our before and after scenarios here. I'm going to eliminate this one because it definitely feels possible. R could give G to T in exchange for M and O. That's the first trade that's possible. R could then give Y and Z to S in exchange for L. So the final scenario where R ends up with L, M, and O, that definitely seems possible given these 2 steps. So I'm going to eliminate this one because it does not have to be false. Moving on to B. So B suggests that the after scenario is S ends up with G and M here. So I'm also going to eliminate this one because it's definitely possible. S could give F to R in exchange for G. So S gives F to R for G. Then S could then in turn give away its L to T and receive M in exchange. And that would allow S to end up with G and M. So it's definitely possible. So again, doing much the same, moving on to C here. C suggests that the after scenario is S ends up with K, M, and O. So basically, it took everything that T has. This one is also possible, so I'm going to eliminate it. S could get F to T, and in exchange, it could get K and M. And then S could give L also to T, and then it could also do a one-to-one trade with O. So that's also possible, so we eliminate this one. So moving at a pretty steady clip here, repeating the same process for D. D suggests that T ends up, after all is said and done, with F and a single Y. This already seems really, really off. How could T possibly end up with just one of the class 3s? Just because class 3 is sort of the least valuable class, there's nobody who's going to take one class 3 unless they have a class 3 themselves. So I just don't, on its face, see a way for this to work. But because I don't really know the intimate mechanics of the situation, I'm not 100% sure, but this already seems pretty bad to me. So T could trade K and M to S and exchange receive F. Then it could trade O to R for Y and Z. But from there, there's no way to offload just one of the class 3s. Who'd you just give a class 3 to and not get anything exchanged? We're not allowed to make that trade. The only trades that we can make are the ones listed in the rules. So while I see a way for it to obtain F, and then I see that it obtains Y and Z, how can we get rid of just Z and keep just Y? I really don't see a way for that to happen. The same applies to the flip side. So if we can't get both Y and Z and then just give away only Z, is it possible to obtain just Y on its own? And that also doesn't seem possible here. To do that, you'd have to start off with a single class 3 property, and T does not. There's no scenario where T starts off with just one of the 2 tier 3 properties, class 3 properties. So there's no way for T to just have Z and then trade that for Y and be done with it. That never happens. So I'm going to select this one because there seems to be no way to make this work. But since we're so close to the end of the list, I am just going. So looking at E here, the after suggested by E is that after all is said and done, T ends up with property G and property L. And this one I'm going to eliminate because it's a lot like A through C. It seems feasible in a small number of trades. T could trade K and M to R in exchange for G. So that's how T obtained G and got rid of K and M. And then it could trade O to L in exchange for, O to S in exchange for L. So it can end up with G and L based on what it had to start with. So this definitely seems feasible. So we eliminated A, B, C, and E, so that leaves us only D, and we are satisfied at this point. So takeaways. Process games can be scary. Without a set diagram like a ordering situation or grouping or even a matching situation or even an in and out situation, which has its own sort of diagram, and questions that say stuff like after some unspecified number of trades, it does feel at first glance like the game could force us to do many iterations of the process. And to be frank, some process games kind of actually do. There is a relatively older one, I believe, that does make you do a higher number of these things. But that didn't happen here. The vast majority of the time, we dealt with single trades. Question 23 is pretty much the only one that dealt with more, and that was just 2 trades. And they were all for eliminations, which they were pretty straightforwardly allowed under the rules. It really wasn't that hard, is what I mean to say. So, in summary, don't obsess over the diagramming. I know that's kind of what we're all very comfortable with because that gives us some measure of control. But really, what you should focus on when you're faced with a processing situation is to find a way to represent the starting scenario, then accept that you might be best off doing a before and after setup like I did. Also, the after setup need not be complete, as you saw in question 23 and pretty much most of the other questions. We didn't have a completed after diagram. Start with what you know to be true and make your analysis from there. Process games do share the same fundamental task with all other LG. You have some data to start with and you apply the rules to see what happens next. The final note that I want to make is that, so the question you might have is, okay, that all sounds great, but this all seems like it's geared towards knowing that you have a process game to begin with. How do you recognize a process game? And this admittedly is something that I don't have too much tangible advice for. All I can say is that if you can't find a way to diagram it, and they seem to be talking about things that happen in like rounds, like one round of trading, one round of promotions, one round of hiring, and they give you a setup like that, where it seems like you don't really know how to diagram, but they are telling you that there's going to be a set of parameters or rules, and your job is to apply them to some kind of starting situation. That's your hint. So again, a process game, the only giveaway that I can think of is that they're going to give you a starting situation, and then they're going to describe to you a set of rules that you are going to be tasked with applying to that starting situation once or multiple times to end up with a changed picture at the end of it all. And so that might generically sound very similar to all other LG, and that was my point. That's actually what other LG does as well. It's just that the pictures are a little bit more formulaic. That's all that it is. So, but yeah, if you want to recognize a process game, that would be the way that I would advise you to do so. They give you an initial situation, and then the rules are presented as things that you apply to the initial situation any number of times to change the initial situation to end up with a before and after scenario. And that, of course, brings us to the end, as usual, where I pan it to the algorithm. Thanks for being here. Like and subscribe. That helps the channel. Leave a comment. Those of you, you guys, even though my content has been somewhat sporadic in the past month or so, I'm still getting emails, which is good. It means that you guys are still engaging with the stuff and still asking questions, still studying. That's a very good thing. And I welcome them all. Feel free to continue bombarding my inbox with requests and questions and that kind of thing. And I do want to, I haven't been saying this out loud, but I do want to emphasize that I have moved away from initially, when I very first started the channel, I was kind of promoting getting electronic copies of the exams from Amazon directly, but that has turned out to be a very bad idea. I myself have obtained them just to see what they're like, and they're formatted terribly. They're awful. So yeah, go with LawHub and 7 Sage. LawHub you have to do anyway to take the exam, so that's a smart idea. But 7 Sage seems to offer the most flexible analytics and just kind of the best set of general tools to kind of help the self-study is what I found. So I have no affiliation with either of them. They're just what I found to be the best things for my students, so that's what I'm doing. I'll see you guys in the next one.